In September 1944, the Allied command launched one of the most ambitious airborne operations of the Second World War, Operation Market Garden. The plan was bold, almost audacious. Airborne divisions would drop deep behind German lines in the Netherlands, seize a chain of critical bridges, and open a highway straight into the industrial heart of Germany. If it worked, the war in Europe might end by Christmas. But the plan depended on speed, surprise, and light infantry holding ground against whatever the enemy threw at them. On September 17th, thousands of paratroopers descended from the sky. Among them were American airborne troops equipped primarily with the lightweight M1 Carbine. The carbine was compact, easy to carry, and ideal for airborne operations. It fed from a 15-round detachable magazine and fired the .30 carbine cartridge. On paper, it was perfect for paratroopers who needed mobility over raw firepower. In reality, the battlefield had other plans. Intelligence had predicted scattered German resistance, rear area units, supply troops, perhaps a few understrength formations. Instead, Allied forces encountered hardened SS Panzer divisions refitting near Arnhem. German armor, machine guns, and experienced infantry were already in place. What was meant to be a lightning strike quickly turned into a brutal urban siege. In towns like Nijmegen and around Arnhem, paratroopers found themselves fighting street by street, house by house. Windows concealed riflemen. Alleyways funneled troops into kill zones. German counterattacks came fast and often with superior numbers. In these close-quarter battles, every second mattered, and every reload could be fatal. The M1 Carbine's 15-round magazine could be emptied in seconds during intense combat. Under stress, fine motor skills deteriorated. A soldier had to drop the empty magazine, reach for a fresh one, insert it cleanly, and rack the bolt if necessary, all while exposed to incoming fire. Even a well-trained paratrooper could fumble. Mud, debris, shaking hands, and adrenaline made it worse. Veterans later recalled the sickening click of an empty chamber, echoing louder in their memory than the gunfire itself. That split second, realizing the weapon was dry, forced a soldier to either dive for cover or stand exposed while reloading. In tight urban streets, there often was no cover. Some men were hit mid-reload, caught between magazines with no rounds left to return fire. German infantry units often carried weapons like the MP-40 submachine gun, capable of sustained automatic fire at close range. Others operated MG-42 machine guns that could dominate entire streets. Against that level of firepower, 15 rounds felt painfully limited. Technical Sergeant David Marshall was not an engineer. He was not assigned to weapons development. By training, he was an Army clerk, a logistics and paperwork man in uniform. But like many non-commissioned officers, he carried a carbine and fought alongside the rest when the shooting started. He saw the problem up close. During one engagement in a marketplace surrounded by brick buildings and narrow roads, his unit was pinned down by German infantry maneuvering aggressively from multiple angles. The Americans fired in controlled bursts, but ammunition drained fast. Marshall watched one paratrooper rise to change magazines and collapse before he could chamber the next round. It wasn't a failure of courage. It wasn't a failure of training. It was time. Time lost in the small mechanical ritual of swapping one metal box for another. As the days passed, Market Garden shifted from offensive thrust to desperate defense. Supplies were thin, reinforcements were delayed, ammunition had to be conserved, but firefights kept erupting at close range. The lightweight advantage of the M1 Carbine no longer felt like an advantage. Its compactness came at the cost of sustained fire. Marshall began to notice something simple but powerful. The magazine itself was the bottleneck. The rifle worked reliably. The cartridge was adequate at short range. The weakness was not the weapon, it was the interruption. 15 rounds, then pause. 15 rounds, then pause again. In the middle of chaos, those pauses were deadly. Around him, soldiers improvised constantly. They taped extra grenades to their webbing. They shared ammunition across units. They scavenged from fallen comrades. Adaptation was survival, but no official solution existed for the reload problem. Regulations governed weapon modification strictly. Altering issued equipment without authorization could lead to disciplinary action, even court-martial. Still, the reality on the ground was harsher than any regulation. Marshall's background in logistics meant he understood materials, supply chains, and improvisation. He knew what scrap metal was available in local workshops. He knew the basic dimensions of the carbine's magazine well. He also knew that 2 loaded magazines weighed little more than 1, and that most soldiers carried several anyway. The idea that began forming in his mind was almost embarrassingly simple. What if the pause between magazines could be cut in half? What if instead of reaching into a pouch for a fresh magazine, a second one was already attached, aligned, ready, inches away from the empty slot? He had no blueprint, no authorization, no guarantee it would work. Only the memory of that paratrooper falling mid-reload in the marketplace and the growing realization that in this kind of fighting, sustained fire, even a few extra seconds, could tip the balance between being overrun and holding the line. As German forces tightened their grip and the ambitious dream of Market Garden began to falter, innovation did not come from high command or distant factories. It began in the mind of a non-engineer, under fire, surrounded by brick walls and smoke. The battlefield was changing faster than the rulebook allowed, and David Marshall was about to break that rulebook.
By the 3rd day of Operation Market Garden, the optimism of the initial landings had vanished. What was supposed to be a rapid advance across a chain of Dutch bridges had turned into a grinding, defensive struggle. German counterattacks were no longer sporadic. They were coordinated, aggressive, and relentless. Armored units that Allied intelligence had underestimated were now fully engaged, cutting off roads and isolating airborne positions. For the American paratroopers on the ground, the battlefield had shrunk to streets, intersections, stairwells, and shattered storefronts. Urban combat magnified every weakness. Engagement distances were short. Reaction time was measured in fractions of a second. German infantry moved quickly between buildings, firing from windows and doorways. Machine gun teams established overlapping fields of fire that turned open streets into lethal corridors. In this environment, fire superiority was everything. The side that could keep shooting longer usually survived. The standard-issue M1 Carbine was accurate and easy to handle, but its 15-round magazine limited sustained fire. In training, 15 rounds seemed reasonable. In a live firefight, it vanished almost instantly. A soldier could expend a full magazine in just a few seconds of rapid semi-automatic fire, especially when suppressing multiple targets. The real danger wasn't just running out of ammunition, it was the transition. The moment between empty and ready. Under calm conditions, swapping magazines was straightforward. Press the release, pull the empty magazine free, insert a fresh one, ensure it locks, resume firing. But combat is not calm. Hands shake, sweat mixes with dust and brick powder, gloves snag on gear, magazines sometimes fail to seat correctly. A bolt might not fully close. Even a 1-second delay can stretch into 3 or 4. 3 or 4 seconds under direct fire is an eternity. Soldiers later described the sensory overload, the crack of rifles echoing off walls, debris falling from facades, shouted commands lost in gunfire. In that chaos, muscle memory could fail. Some paratroopers dropped fresh magazines in the mud while trying to reload. Others instinctively ducked behind cover, reducing their ability to return fire and allowing German troops to advance a few more meters.
Technical Sergeant David Marshall observed this pattern repeatedly. He was not stationed in a laboratory. He was moving between defensive positions, relaying information, distributing ammunition, and fighting when necessary. His role gave him a wider view of the engagement than many riflemen fixed in one position. He noticed something troubling. Whenever American fire slackened, even briefly, German troops pushed forward aggressively. The enemy seemed to sense the rhythm of American magazines. Bursts of return fire would suddenly thin out, and that thinning created opportunity. In one engagement near a narrow market street, a squad was holding the corner of a stone building. German infantry advanced from both ends of the road, using parked vehicles and door frames as cover. The Americans fired steadily, keeping the enemy pinned. Then, almost in unison, 2 carbines ran dry. The distinctive pause in gunfire was immediate. The Germans surged. One paratrooper managed to reload quickly, the other fumbled, his fresh magazine slipping from his grasp and clattering onto cobblestone. He bent instinctively to grab it. A burst of enemy fire struck the wall inches above him, spraying fragments across his helmet. Only the quick intervention of another soldier prevented a breakthrough at that corner. The position held, barely. Marshall began mentally calculating. 15 rounds per magazine. A well-trained rifleman might carry 5 to 7 magazines readily accessible. That meant a soldier could fire perhaps 100 rounds before needing to dig deeper into supply or rely on resupply. But in intense contact, those rounds were spent in minutes. German units, particularly those equipped with submachine guns, could maintain a more continuous volume of fire at close range. Even when their weapons had comparable magazine sizes, the psychological effect of uninterrupted bursts gave them momentum. Momentum in urban combat translates to territory. Territory translates to survival. Marshall understood that doctrine emphasized controlled fire, not spraying ammunition. But doctrine also assumed predictable engagements and balanced forces. Market Garden was proving neither predictable nor balanced. The airborne units were isolated, stretched thin, and often outnumbered. Every reload was a gamble. There was another factor, visibility. In open countryside, a soldier could often drop behind a hedgerow or shallow depression to reload. In town centers, cover was vertical and fragmented. A doorway might protect one angle but expose another. Windows offered firing positions but also turned soldiers into silhouettes. Reloading required shifting posture, and shifting posture meant exposure. Marshall's frustration grew not from a single catastrophic failure, but from an accumulation. The repeated pattern of strong defense interrupted by mechanical necessity. The repeated sight of men forced to break eye contact with the enemy to look down at their rifles. The repeated surge of German movement at precisely those moments. He also knew the Army's rules. Weapons were standardized for a reason. Unauthorized modifications could compromise reliability. An altered firearm that malfunctioned could cost lives. Discipline and uniformity were cornerstones of military effectiveness. A technical sergeant had no authority to redesign equipment in the field, but the battlefield was already redesigning the rules. One evening, after a prolonged firefight, Marshall examined several empty M1 Carbine magazines laid out on a wooden crate. They were simple stamped metal boxes, rugged, replaceable, not complex machinery. He handled them side by side, noticing their symmetry, their identical dimensions. What struck him was not their limitation, but their potential. If the pause between magazines was the problem, perhaps the solution was not to eliminate the reload, but to shorten it so drastically that the enemy could no longer exploit it. If a second loaded magazine could be brought into position instantly without reaching into a pouch, the dangerous gap might shrink to a fraction of a second. It was a small idea, almost obvious, and yet no such device had been issued to them. Marshall knew that experimenting with issued equipment could bring charges. He knew that time and materials were scarce, but he also knew that the men around him were fighting for survival, not regulation compliance. The reload problem was no longer theoretical. It had a body count. As German pressure intensified and the dream of a swift victory faded further, Marshall reached a quiet conclusion. Waiting for official solutions was not an option. If the Army had not provided an answer, someone on the ground would have to create one. And that someone, whether authorized or not, was about to be him.
By the time the fighting around Arnhem and Nijmegen had settled into a brutal stalemate, the paratroopers of Operation Market Garden were no longer thinking about grand strategy. They were thinking about survival from one hour to the next. Ammunition was rationed, casualties were mounting, positions changed hands more than once in a single day. Technical Sergeant David Marshall had reached a point where observation was no longer enough. He believed he understood the problem, the lethal pause between magazines in the M1 Carbine, but understanding did not stop bullets. Action might. The opportunity came in an unlikely place, a damaged workshop on the edge of a Belgian town previously passed through during the Allied advance. The building had once repaired farm equipment. Its windows were cracked, its roof partially splintered, but inside were tools, vices, clamps, metal scraps, and a workbench still sturdy enough to serve a new purpose. Marshall was not trained as a machinist. His experience was administrative, logistical. But war has a way of compressing skill sets. Soldiers learned to repair radios without being radio technicians, to drive vehicles without being mechanics. Improvisation became normal. He gathered 2 empty carbine magazines and placed them side by side on the bench, identical in length, identical in width. The idea was simple. Join them in a way that allowed one to be inverted quickly after the first ran dry. No digging into pouches, no searching by touch, just rotate and reinsert. At first, he experimented with tape, common cloth tape used in the field. It held, but barely. The magazines shifted under pressure. If misaligned by even a few millimeters, the second magazine would not seat properly into the rifle. A failed insertion in combat could jam the weapon entirely. He needed something rigid. From scrap metal, he cut thin strips and bent them into a crude bracket. Using a vise, he tightened the pieces around the magazines, testing their alignment repeatedly. Too tight, and the magazines would deform. Too loose, and they would wobble. He adjusted, tightened, loosened, and adjusted again. Each modification was guided not by engineering theory, but by tactile feedback. He inserted the paired magazines into his carbine over and over, listening for a solid click of proper seating. He pulled them free, flipped the weapon slightly, and practiced rotating to the second magazine. It was awkward at first. The combined weight changed the balance of the rifle. The protruding second magazine altered the silhouette, but it worked. The next question was reliability under fire. Marshall shared the prototype with a small group of trusted paratroopers. He did not advertise it widely. Unauthorized equipment modifications could lead to disciplinary action, especially if they compromised standardization. If a commanding officer deemed the device unsafe, it could result in charges severe enough to end a career. Still, several soldiers volunteered to test it. The first live-fire trial took place behind a partially collapsed brick wall, away from immediate enemy observation. One paratrooper fired 15 rounds in steady succession. The bolt locked back. Instead of reaching for his pouch, he tilted the rifle, released the empty magazine, rotated the paired unit, and slammed the second magazine into place. The gap in gunfire was shorter, noticeably shorter. They repeated the drill multiple times. There were issues. On one attempt, the bracket shifted slightly, affecting alignment. On another, the added bulk made prone firing more awkward. But the concept held. The transition time between magazines had been reduced dramatically, not eliminated, but compressed. The true test came sooner than expected.
During a renewed German push along a narrow street lined with two-story buildings, one of the volunteers carried the modified magazines into combat. Enemy infantry advanced under covering fire from an MG-42 positioned deeper down the road. The Americans returned fire from windows and doorways. The paratrooper emptied his first magazine quickly, suppressing movement near a doorway across the street. As the bolt locked back, he performed the practiced motion: drop, rotate, insert, fire. The gap in gunfire was so brief that the German infantry hesitated instead of advancing. That hesitation mattered. It denied them momentum. It kept them pinned. Others nearby saw it happen. After the engagement, word spread quietly, not through official channels, but through conversation, a way to cut reload time, a way to keep firing just a little longer. Soldiers began asking Marshall to build more of the brackets. He returned to the workshop whenever possible, refining the design. He adjusted the spacing between magazines to reduce interference. He experimented with slight offsets to make gripping easier. He was careful. He understood that if the device caused a malfunction in a critical moment, it would confirm every argument against unauthorized modification. So he tested each pair repeatedly before handing it over. The risk remained real. If a senior officer discovered what he was doing, Marshall could face accusations of altering government property. The Army relied on standardization to ensure predictability in supply and maintenance. A battlefield innovation, no matter how practical, challenged that structure. But the battlefield had already made its judgment. In close combat, the dual magazine setup provided roughly twice the immediate available ammunition before a soldier needed to reach into his gear. More importantly, it turned a vulnerable 3 or 4 second reload into something closer to one fluid motion. It did not make the carbine automatic. It did not increase the power of the .30 cartridge. It did not solve the broader strategic failures unfolding around them. But at the level where war is decided second by second, it altered the rhythm of the fight. German troops advancing against American positions now encountered more continuous resistance. The predictable lull between magazines became less predictable. In street fighting, unpredictability is power. Marshall never claimed he had invented something revolutionary. In his mind, he had merely solved a practical problem with the materials at hand. 2 magazines, a bracket, a change in angle, a shortened pause. Yet in the smoke-filled streets of Martingarten, that shortened pause could mean the difference between holding a corner and losing it, between surviving an assault and being overrun. What had begun as a quiet experiment in a damaged workshop was now spreading through the ranks, one paired magazine at a time. And the battlefield was starting to feel the difference. As the fighting intensified in the later stages of Operation Market Garden, the battlefield around the Dutch towns became a maze of contested streets. Bridges were still the strategic objective, but for the men on the ground, survival depended on controlling intersections, rooftops, and narrow corridors between brick buildings. Every block mattered. Every doorway could conceal an enemy rifle. By this point, several paratroopers were carrying Marshall's improvised dual-magazine setup on their M1 Carbines. The modification was still unofficial, still technically unauthorized, but in combat, effectiveness spoke louder than regulation. The real proving ground came during a concentrated German counterattack aimed at pushing American forces out of a central marketplace. The square was surrounded by 2-story buildings with large windows facing inward. It offered both visibility and vulnerability. If the Germans seized it, they could split the American defensive line and isolate several squads. German infantry began advancing under covering fire, using the edges of buildings and overturned carts for concealment. Reports later indicated that nearly 50 enemy soldiers were involved in the push, supported by machine gun fire from a side street. The Americans defending the square were outnumbered and low on heavy weapons. Their primary tools were rifles, carbines, and determination. When the first wave moved across the open stretch of cobblestone, American paratroopers opened fire from upper-floor windows and ground-level doorways. The sharp cracks of carbines echoed through the square. German troops dropped, but others continued advancing, firing as they moved. Under normal conditions, 15 rounds would have forced immediate pauses across the defensive line. The rhythm of American fire would thin in staggered bursts as individual rifles ran empty. German troops had learned to recognize that rhythm, the subtle lull that signaled opportunity. This time, the lull did not come as expected. One paratrooper on the second floor of a bakery building emptied his first magazine while targeting a cluster of advancing infantry. Instead of pulling back to reload from his pouch, he executed the practiced motion: release, rotate, insert. The second magazine locked in almost seamlessly. His fire resumed so quickly that the Germans below struggled to identify a gap. On the opposite side of the square, another soldier did the same, and another. The effect was cumulative. The defensive line maintained a more continuous stream of fire, not perfectly uninterrupted, but far steadier than before. German troops attempting to exploit a perceived pause found themselves still under pressure. Several accounts describe enemy soldiers hesitating mid-sprint, unsure whether the Americans were actually reloading or simply adjusting positions. That hesitation slowed the assault. Continuous fire does more than inflict casualties. It shapes movement. In close quarters, suppressive fire forces attackers to remain behind cover longer than planned. It disrupts coordination. It prevents momentum from building. In the marketplace engagement, those extra seconds of sustained resistance allowed American defenders to reposition slightly, redistribute ammunition, and call for limited support from adjacent units. At one critical moment, a group of German soldiers attempted to rush a ground-floor entrance on the northern side of the square. 2 American paratroopers were inside, both armed with carbines fitted with the dual-magazine setup. They fired in controlled but rapid succession. When the first magazines ran dry, the transition to the second was near instantaneous. The doorway remained covered. German troops attempting to cross the open space were caught in that continuous arc of fire. Several fell, the rest retreated to cover. The assault stalled. By the end of the engagement, the marketplace remained in American hands. Estimates suggested that roughly 50 German soldiers had participated in the push, with significant casualties suffered during repeated attempts to cross exposed ground. The defenders had not gained reinforcements or heavier weapons during the fight. What they had gained was time created by reducing the vulnerability of reloads. Officers initially reacted with mixed feelings when they noticed the paired magazines. Some were concerned about reliability and deviation from issued equipment. Standardization was a pillar of military logistics. If every soldier began modifying weapons independently, maintenance and supply chains could become chaotic. But the battlefield results were difficult to ignore. Reports from squad leaders indicated that soldiers using the paired magazines were able to maintain pressure longer during close engagements. The modification did not increase total ammunition carried. It simply made 2 magazines function as a single, faster access unit. In close-quarter urban fighting, that subtle shift mattered. Word spread beyond Marshall's immediate circle. More paratroopers requested the bracketed magazines. Some improvised their own versions using tape when metal brackets were unavailable. The concept adapted organically. It was not a factory-issued solution. It was a soldier's answer to a soldier's problem. The psychological impact was also significant. Soldiers felt less exposed during reloads. Confidence in close-quarter firefights increased. Knowing that a second magazine was already aligned and ready reduced hesitation. That confidence translated into firmer defensive stances and more aggressive counterfire. German forces continued pressing elsewhere, and the broader operation still faced strategic setbacks. Market Garden would ultimately fail to achieve its ambitious objective of securing a clear path into Germany. Bridges were destroyed or held too briefly. Supply lines stretched thin. Airborne units suffered heavy casualties, but at the micro level, at the scale of one street, one building, one square, small adaptations changed outcomes. Marshall's modification did not appear in official communiques. It was not celebrated in press releases. It was passed hand to hand, explained in quiet conversations, tested in live fire, refined in damaged workshops. Yet its effect was measurable in the survival of the men who used it. In urban combat, dominance is often decided not by grand strategy, but by fractions of seconds. A reload shortened, a hesitation induced, a push delayed just long enough to break momentum. In the marketplace that day, the Americans held their ground against superior numbers. Continuous fire denied the attackers their window of opportunity, and a device built from scrap metal and determination had reshaped the rhythm of battle. The innovation was still unofficial. The risks to Marshall's career remained, but on the streets of Market Garden, results were becoming impossible to dismiss. The rulebook had not changed. The battlefield had.
By late September 1944, the outcome of Operation Market Garden was becoming clear. The ambitious attempt to secure a rapid route into Germany had stalled. The bridge at Arnhem proved, in the words that would echo through history, a bridge too far. Airborne units had fought with determination, but isolation, strong German resistance, and stretched supply lines forced to withdraw from several key objectives. When the surviving American paratroopers regrouped, they carried more than exhaustion and casualty lists. They carried lessons. Among those lessons was a small, unofficial innovation that had spread quietly through the ranks: the paired magazine system for the M1 Carbine. What began as David Marshall's improvised solution in a damaged workshop had become a practical tool used by multiple squads during the heaviest fighting. But wartime necessity does not automatically erase regulation. As units reorganized and equipment was inspected, questions began to surface. Armorers noticed modified magazines connected by metal brackets. Some officers asked who had authorized the alteration of government-issued equipment. The U.S. Army operated on standardization for a reason: reliability, safety, and logistical predictability. Unauthorized modifications could theoretically compromise feeding, damage the rifle's magazine catch, or create unexpected malfunctions. Marshall understood the risk. As a technical sergeant, he was experienced enough to know that altering issued gear without approval could lead to formal charges. In peacetime, such an action might have resulted in immediate disciplinary proceedings. Even in wartime, accountability mattered. For a brief period, there was real tension. Accounts from veterans suggest that a senior officer initially viewed the modification as reckless. The concern was not just about procedure, it was about precedent. If every soldier began customizing weapons independently, chaos could follow. A battlefield innovation that worked in one context might fail disastrously in another. Marshall was reportedly questioned about the origin of the brackets. He did not claim to be an inventor or a hero. He explained the problem as he had seen it: men exposed during reloads, momentum lost in close quarters, opportunities seized by the enemy during predictable pauses in fire. More importantly, squad leaders spoke up. They described specific engagements where the shortened reload time had helped maintain defensive pressure. They emphasized that the modification did not alter the internal mechanics of the rifle. It did not change the caliber, the bolt, or the firing system. It simply paired two standard magazines together in a way that reduced transition time. In other words, it enhanced human efficiency without compromising mechanical integrity. The argument was practical. The paired magazines had been tested under live combat conditions. They had functioned reliably, and they had contributed to holding ground against numerically superior forces. The potential court-martial quietly faded.
While there is no record of an immediate formal adoption of Marshall's exact bracket design during World War II, the concept itself did not disappear. Soldiers in later campaigns continued improvising similar setups, sometimes using tape, sometimes using metal clips. The idea, two magazines coupled side by side for faster transitions, proved too useful to ignore. In the decades that followed, magazine couplers would appear in various forms across different armed forces. Later conflicts saw officially manufactured couplers designed specifically to join magazines for quicker reloads. The principle was simple and enduring: reduce the vulnerable gap between empty and ready. What had once been considered an illegal hack gradually became a recognized field adaptation. Marshall never patented the idea. He did not receive a formal commendation for weapons innovation. His contribution remained largely within the memory of those who had served alongside him. But influence in warfare is not always measured by medals or paperwork. Sometimes it is measured by survival, by the number of soldiers who made it home because a small problem was solved under pressure. Market Garden remains a case study in bold strategy and costly miscalculation. Historians analyze the operational overreach, the intelligence failures, and the logistical strain. Yet within that broader narrative are countless micro-stories of adaptation. Individual soldiers confronting immediate problems and refusing to accept preventable loss as inevitable. Marshall's modification represented a larger truth about modern warfare. Innovation does not belong exclusively to laboratories or high command. It often begins at the lowest levels, where the consequences of delay are immediate and personal. The paired magazines did not win Market Garden. They did not change the strategic outcome of the campaign, but in the confined geometry of Dutch streets, they altered the rhythm of firefights. They denied the enemy predictable pauses. They bought seconds, and in combat, seconds can equal lives. Long after the smoke cleared, the lesson endured. Military organizations would increasingly recognize the value of feedback from frontline troops. Field modifications, once dismissed outright, began to be studied more closely. Practical solutions born in combat environments informed future equipment design. Somewhere in the memory of those marketplace engagements, the image remained: a soldier's carbine running dry, a quick rotation, a fresh magazine locking into place almost instantly, fire resuming before the enemy could advance. A small piece of scrap metal, a shortened pause, a shift in momentum. David Marshall had broken the rules, but he had done so to close a deadly gap between intention and survival. And though his name never became widely known, the principle he applied, solve the problem in front of you even if no one has given you permission, would echo quietly through the evolution of infantry tactics for decades to come.